The phone rang just as Annie set down her paintbrush. It was Nathan. His voice was as cold and detached as the countless nights they had shared the same bed in silence. "I'll be late. Don't wait up." Short, curt, and devoid of any emotion, just like every other time. Annie sat frozen, gripping the brush tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the half-finished painting before her. The image depicted a brightly lit room filled with laughter. The warm hues she had painted felt like a cruel mockery of her own life. In this house, too big, too pristine, too silent, she felt like a forgotten extra in someone else's story, waiting for the page to turn. The sound of the doorbell startled her. Annie blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Who could be visiting this late? She walked down the hallway, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. When she opened it, it wasn't Nathan, despite the fleeting, foolish hope she had that he might surprise her with flowers or an apology. No, it was Elias, Nathan's half-brother. He stood there, rain droplets clinging to his leather jacket, a tool bag slung casually over his shoulder. Elias smiled a half-smile that felt so effortless, yet it had the strange power to render Annie momentarily speechless. "Annie," he said, his voice warm. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Elias, what are you doing here so late?" she asked, trying to keep her tone even, though her heart had already quickened its pace. "Nathan asked me to drop by and fix a few things around the house," Elias replied, stepping into the doorway. His smile lingered, and his dark eyes held a knowing glint. "He said you probably wouldn't need the help, but I think he underestimated just how wrong he could be." Annie chuckled softly, her laugh escaping before she could stop it. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, she felt that something had shifted. The air in the house grew heavier, charged with an unfamiliar tension, as though Elias had brought a quiet storm with him. For the first time in months, the oppressive emptiness she had grown used to seemed to lift, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. Elias set his tool bag down by the wall, his eyes sweeping the house with an almost curious intensity. "This place," he mused aloud, "is so much like Nathan, perfect, polished, but suffocating." Annie let out a laugh, short, sharp, and unintentional. "He likes everything neat and orderly," she muttered. Elias turned to her, his gaze direct and unrelenting under the soft glow of the hallway light. "Do you like living in all this order?" The question caught her off guard. Annie hesitated, turning away to escape the weight of his gaze. She walked toward the kitchen, pretending to search for something in the fridge, but his words clung to her like shadows. His question was simple, yet terrifying in its implications. "Are you happy?" And she hated the truth that simmered beneath her silence. She didn't know. As she fumbled with the bottle of water, she heard his footsteps behind her. He was close, too close. She could feel the warmth of his presence contrasting sharply with the chill of the house. "Annie," he said. Her name rolled off his tongue in a voice so low, so intimate, that it made her breath catch. She turned slowly to face him, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes she had never noticed before. It wasn't playful or teasing, it was raw, unfiltered intensity. And in that moment, Annie forgot Nathan, she forgot the endless silences, the hollow words, the routines that had drained her of every spark of joy. All she could see, all she could feel, was Elias standing inches away from her, his presence filling the kitchen like a fire that had just been ignited. That was when Annie realized the storm Elias had brought with him wasn't just unsettling her home. It was unsettling her heart. The kitchen was bathed in a soft golden light, yet Annie felt as though she was standing in complete darkness. Elias's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "Do you like this life?" She hadn't answered, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure she even knew the answer. Her life with Nathan resembled a meticulously framed painting, perfect, polished, but utterly hollow. Annie's thoughts drifted back to the early days of their marriage. Nathan had once been a man of passion, someone who could spend entire evenings in her studio, admiring her unfinished works. He used to praise her, kiss her paint-stained hands. and tell her they were the brushes that painted entire worlds. But as time passed, the words of admiration gave way to work calls, forgotten promises, and eventually long, heart-wrenching silences. She couldn't pinpoint when it had begun, but at some point, Annie started to feel like just another piece of furniture in her own home. Nathan loved order, loved the grandeur he could display to friends, and she suspected that to him, she was merely another piece in his collection. He no longer looked at her as the woman he once adored. Instead, his gaze was perpetually drawn to his phone, his contracts, his projects. Annie had tried to hold on. There was a night, not long ago, when she set up a romantic dinner by candlelight, wearing the dress Nathan had once told her was his favorite. But when he came home, all he did was loosen his tie, open his laptop, and mutter a single sentence, "I'm too tired tonight. Let's do this another time." That night, she sat alone at the beautifully set table, tears falling silently onto plates of cold, untouched food. With Elias, everything was different. From the moment he entered the house, he looked at her as though she truly existed, as though she mattered. Elias didn't talk much, but every word he said had a way of cutting through her, of stripping away her defenses. It was as if he could see all the things she tried to bury, even from herself. At times, it scared her, but there were moments when she craved that kind of truth, even if it hurt. "Did you love painting as much as this once?" Elias asked one afternoon, as they tidied her studio together. He held up one of her unfinished works, studying the bold but incomplete strokes with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Annie didn't answer right away. She stood there, her hands trembling as she recalled what it felt like to truly lose herself in her art. "I used to think painting was everything," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "But now I'm not sure I can feel anything at all." Elias carefully set the painting down and stepped closer. "So why did you stop?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers, probing deeper than she was comfortable with. Annie met his gaze, her own eyes clouded with sadness, because Nathan doesn't need it. He needs a perfect wife, not an artist with paint-smeared hands. Her answer made Elias chuckle softly, though the sound was tinged with bitterness. "So you gave up who you are to become what he wanted. Is it worth it?" Annie, she didn't respond, but deep inside, she knew that question wasn't just for Elias. It was one she needed to answer for herself. That night, the rain came unexpectedly, tapping against the glass panes and streaking down like silent tears. Annie stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze lost in the haze veil of falling rain. Nathan had been gone for 2 days, and the house felt colder, emptier with each passing hour. But tonight was different. Elias was here, and his presence filled the space with an unfamiliar energy she couldn't quite name. In the kitchen, Elias was busying himself with something. Annie wasn't sure what he was doing, but the soft clanking of objects and faint movements carried through the house, breaking the suffocating silence she had grown used to. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway of the living room, holding two steaming mugs of hot cocoa. "You need this," he said, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Annie smiled, taking the warm mug from his hands. "You always know how to lighten the mood," she said, her voice soft. Elias sat down beside her, closer than was necessary. The warmth of his body seemed to radiate through the air between them. "Are you always this tense?" he asked, his tone a mix of playful teasing and genuine curiosity. She chuckled lightly, the sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. "I don't think I'm tense. It's just ... Maybe I've forgotten how to relax. Relaxing isn't hard," Elias replied, tilting his head as he studied her. "You just have to want to try." Annie opened her mouth to respond, but a flash of lightning lit up the room, followed by a thunderclap that rattled the windows. The rain intensified, hammering against the glass as though it might shatter it. Elias raised an eyebrow and stood. "Have you ever gone walking in the rain?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "Are you serious? It's pouring out there." Annie shook her head, But before she could say anything more, Elias reached for her hand and pulled her to her feet. There are some things in life you just have to do once. Annie, come on. Before she could protest, he was leading her out the front door, both of them running straight into the icy downpour. Annie laughed, really laughed, the sound blending with the rhythmic patter of rain. It felt strange, liberating, as if the storm had swept away the invisible chains she'd been carrying for years. Elias led her to the backyard, where the slick stone steps glistened under the faint glow of the porch light. They stood there, drenched to the bone, but Annie didn't care. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt alive. There was no restraint, no mask to wear, just her, the rain, and the unbridled sense of freedom that came with it. Elias stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Do you know what you look like when you laugh?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Annie froze, the smile fading slowly from her lips. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, like someone who just found herself again. He took another step forward, so close now that she could feel his breath mingling with the cold rain. "Have you ever wondered if you lived differently, if you allowed yourself to? Would you be happier?" The question lingered in the air, cutting through the rain and lodging itself deep in her heart. Annie opened her mouth to answer, but no words came, and then, as if everything had been leading to this moment, Elias slowly raised his hand and brushed his fingertips against her cheek. His touch was hesitant, as though waiting for her to pull away, but she didn't. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, Annie felt every ounce of logic, every ounce of control she had worked so hard to hold on to slip away. Elias leaned in, his lips barely grazing hers, a whisper of a kiss. But that soft, tentative touch was enough to send warmth coursing through her, chasing away the chill of the storm. Annie closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to him, as all the fears and restraints she had clung to melted away in the rain. When they pulled apart, Annie's breath came in uneven gasps, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with both longing and uncertainty, as if he'd understood the enormity of what had just happened. "If you want me to stop, I will," he murmured, his voice hoarse and raw, but Annie didn't answer. She stood there, letting the rain soak through her clothes and into her skin, as the feeling she had tried so desperately to deny rose to the surface, undeniable and unrelenting. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting pale rays across Annie's face, but it did little to clear the chaos storming in her mind. She sat upright in bed, clutching the blanket tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her from slipping into the emptiness she felt threatening to engulf her. The memory of last night lingered like a searing mark on her lips. The kiss with Elias wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was an awakening, a spark reigniting something she had buried deep within herself for years. But now, in the stark clarity of daylight, the weight of it all pressed down on her with crushing force. Last night hadn't just been an impulsive mistake, it was a boundary crossed, a line obliterated. Elias had left early that morning, but not without leaving a note on the kitchen counter. The words were brief but heavy. "Last night was real. I'll wait for you." The note felt like a 1,000-pound weight in her chest. Annie knew she had to make a decision, but she hadn't expected it to come so soon. By noon, she was still trapped in the maze of her own thoughts when the sound of the front door opening jolted her upright. Nathan was home. He entered with his usual air of weariness, but there was something different about him this time. His gaze, sharp and probing, lingered on her a little too long. Annie did her best to remain composed, but his presence suddenly felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in around her. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked, his voice low but tinged with suspicion. "I'm fine," Annie replied quickly, her eyes unable to meet his. That evening, they all sat down for dinner. Annie, Nathan, and Elias, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Elias attempted to maintain a casual demeanor, but his glances toward Annie were quick and telling. Nathan, though silent, seemed to sense the undercurrent in the room. The air between them was taut, like a wire stretched afar, ready to snap. And it did. Nathan abruptly set down his knife, his gaze piercing as he turned to Elias. "You've been staying here for quite a while now, haven't you?" he said, his voice calm but cutting. "It seems you're getting a bit too comfortable in this house." Elias smirked, his jaw tightening as though preparing to respond. But Annie spoke before the situation could escalate. "Nathan, don't make a scene. I asked Elias to stay and help with a few things around the house. He hasn't been a bother at all." Nathan's eyes flicked toward her, sharp as a blade. "Is that so, Annie? Or is there something I'm not being told?" His words landed like a hammer, shattering the fragile silence in the room. Annie's chest tightened, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. In that instant, she realized just how precarious her position had become. One wrong move, one poorly chosen word, and everything would collapse. "What are you talking about, Nathan?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady, though it trembled at the edges. Nathan didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, his gaze heavy with suspicion and something else she couldn't quite place. After a long, excruciating pause, he stood and left the room without another word, leaving the weight of his presence behind like an open wound. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias remained seated, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring himself. Finally, he broke the stillness. "Are you going to tell him?" he asked, his voice rough but steady, laced with urgency. Annie turned to him, her eyes red and glistening. "And what should I say, Elias? That I betrayed him. That I allowed myself to feel something I shouldn't have." "It's not about what you shouldn't feel," Elias interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "It's about what you deserve to feel. It's about being brave enough to live the life you want." His words struck her like a blow, raw and unrelenting. Annie didn't respond. She rose from the table and walked out of the room, leaving Elias behind, his eyes following her retreating figure until she disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. That night, as Annie lay in bed, tears streamed silently down her face. Soaking the pillow beneath her, she was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path she chose, there would be no going back. On one side was a marriage steeped in responsibility, devoid of warmth. On the other, a blazing, unpredictable connection with Elias. But Annie knew, deep down, that either choice would demand sacrifices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Annie couldn't sleep. The night stretched on, dark and endless, her mind a labyrinth of tangled thoughts with no clear way out. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the windows like a ghostly reminder that time was slipping by. Indifferent to her turmoil, in the oppressive silence of the night, she could hear every frantic beat of her heart wild and erratic, as though it were trying to tear itself free from her chest. Unable to bear the suffocating weight of the bedroom any longer, Annie rose from the bed. The darkness enveloped her as she stepped into the hallway. The quiet of the house was no longer comforting but eerie, hollow. Each step across the cold wooden floor felt like she was drawing closer to a decision she wasn't sure she was ready to make. The door to the living room was ajar, and a faint glow from the table lamp spilled out into the hallway. Inside, Elias sat hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes lost in thought. He didn't look up as she entered, but her presence was enough to shift the air in the room. Annie hesitated by the door, unsure of how to start. Finally, it was Elias who broke the silence. "Have you decided yet?" he asked softly, his voice steady, a tinge with a quiet tremor. Annie didn't respond immediately. She walked closer, her gaze fixed on the flickering light of the lamp, its unsteady glow mirroring the chaos in her mind. "I don't know, Elias," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels so overwhelming. I don't know if I have the courage to change." Elias rose from his seat and took a step closer. He reached out his hand, brushing lightly against hers, a touch so fleeting that Annie couldn't tell if it was meant to comfort her or plead with her. "I'll be here," he said, his voice resolute, his eyes holding a sincerity that pierced through her walls. no matter what you choose. But Annie, you need to start living for yourself, not for anyone else. His words were like a blade, cutting through her carefully constructed facade. Living for yourself. Who had she been? A passionate artist, a free spirit, or just a shadow in Nathan's world? Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Annie froze as Nathan stepped into the room, his face an unreadable mask, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He stood there, taking in the scene, the closeness between them, the tension in the air. Before his gaze settled on her, "Annie," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What's going on here?" Time seemed to stop. Annie felt her heart seize in her chest. Elias remained still, refusing to look away from Nathan's piercing glare. But in that moment, Annie knew that the fragile equilibrium she had been clinging to had shattered. There was no more hiding, no more running. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling but firm with resolve, "we need to talk." But before she could say another word, Nathan raised a hand to silence her. "There's nothing to talk about," he said coldly, his tone cutting like frost. "I've seen enough." His words hung heavy in the room, final and unyielding. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway before fading into the shadows. Annie didn't follow him. She didn't call out to stop him. She simply stood there, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. Elias stepped closer, but this time she held up a hand to stop him. "No, Elias," she said, her voice breaking. "I need to be alone." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression filled with quiet anguish. Finally, he nodded, his eyes heavy with unspoken pain. "All right," he said softly, "but you know where to find me if you need." Elias left the room, his footsteps fading into silence. Annie stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by the cold emptiness of the house. Slowly, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. In that moment, she realized that, whichever path she chose, there was no going back. She had crossed the threshold, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Annie awoke to a house bathed in stillness. Nathan was gone. Elias was gone. It was just her and the pale sunlight streaming through the windows. She sat down at her work table, picking up a brush for the first time in years. This time, she wasn't painting to please anyone. She wasn't painting to escape. She was painting for herself. On the canvas, she painted a bird breaking free from an open cage, its wings stretching toward an uncertain, a boundless sky. The painting was unfinished, but Annie didn't feel anxious. For the first time, she understood that some stories didn't need a tidy ending to hold meaning, and her life was one of them.